Thank you guys so much for your time. It's really cool that it's virtual. We can be together, but at a distance, and still tackle a pretty meaty topic, which is fun, which is how to leverage LA's digital ecosystem and talent to really take it to the next level for biotech. So I'm Helen McBride. I'll be the moderator for this panel. I'm a life science entrepreneur in residence at Caltech. So normally this event would be in Pasadena, so it would have been really close to walk on over and attend, and I hope to do so next year. With us is a wonderful panel. So we've got a lot of rich experience here that we want to leverage for this discussion today. So we have Llewellyn, a partner at MarsBio, the LA County Bioscience Investment Fund. Hey, we have Dylan Morris, who's a general partner at CRV.
Everybody.
Cool. We have Kevin Chang, who's a partner at Upfront Ventures. And June Axup, the Chief Science Officer and a partner at IndieBio. Anyway, too. Okay. So I'd love you guys to introduce yourselves a little bit, talk about why you are here today, really, why you love digital, AI. For those who are based in LA, a little bit about your experience in LA, why you're excited about AI LA and the opportunities of being in the LA area. And for Dylan and June, who have some balanced experience, having been a part of ecosystems in San Francisco and or Boston, also love to hear a little bit about your interest in LA today. So Llewellyn, you can kick us off.
Hi, yeah, sure. So my name is Llewellyn Cox. As introduced, I'm a general partner at MarsBio. We're an early stage biotech focused investment fund. We are the manager for the Los Angeles County Bioscience Investment Fund. So this is a really exciting development where the County of Los Angeles has essentially matched a certain amount of investment through our fund for early stage biotech startups in the area. So we invest in a range of biotechnologies. Essentially anything that uses biology as the underlying technology is our focus area. And one of the things, and I'm sure we'll get into this in the discussion, that we think is really, really exciting is that there's multiple vertical industries that are represented very strongly in Los Angeles. And as biotechnology begins to take over more and more of the supply chain in various industries, we see this as the perfect place to found and grow those companies.
Dylan, you're next on my screen, so
sure.
Let's go to you.
Hi, everyone. Dylan Morris. I'm a GP at CRV. We're the firm formerly known as Charles River Ventures. No association with the CRO in Boston, although we also hail from Boston. The firm's 50 years old this year. We opened up offices in the Bay Area about 10, 15 years ago. So we're in Boston, San Francisco, and Silicon Valley at the moment. Most of the focus of the firm is actually enterprise software, B2B, SaaS. Certainly, AI, new tech plays a big component there. I joined about 4 years ago to help lead the bioengineering practice, where my focus has primarily been on early stage opportunities in drug discovery, drug development, and diagnostics, although we've done some work now in synthetic biology and some exciting new therapeutic modalities. I'm based in San Francisco. I do spend a lot of time in Boston. There's some really interesting arguments we can make about why Boston is unique in the biotech scene, the way that Silicon Valley is really hard to replicate because of the generational turnover of entrepreneurs and investors. But I'm really excited about the possibilities for the LA ecosystem. I spent a few years down there at Caltech. It's my favorite city in America, and I'm going to do whatever I can to sort of help build the ecosystem down there.
That's awesome. Kevin, on to you.
Great. Hey guys, I'm Kevin. I moved to LA when I was 9, so I'm probably a little bit biased, and also spent college and worked out in Boston as well, and also in the Midwest. So I think I have some extra appreciation for being back in LA here now for the last 8 years, which is when I joined Upfront Ventures. We started here back in '96. I've always been a national investor as well as investing in Europe too, but frankly, if you just look at sort of the proportions of our investment, I think it's a good reflection on how much LA has matured as an ecosystem. We're now almost 50% of our investments based down here in LA. and I don't really see that, changing much going forward. As well, on the life sciences side, we kind of the model for the firm is we always look to add additional partners and additional staff and hopefully expand our investment areas and our investment scope. And really it was about 3 years ago when I dusted off my college biology textbooks and started thinking about, hey, there's so many things happening in the life sciences, and you're starting to see a ton of intersection and a lot of interdisciplinary talent coming in from the software and hardware side as well, teaming up with biologists, chemists, etc. So that's when we started spending time in the space as well. We also brought on a bioengineering PhD to join and help us. And so far we've done 2 investments here in LA, and really think that there'll be lots more coming. We focus on the early stages, not dissimilar to Dylan, and typically invest the first few millions at the seed and Series A stage.
Great. And June, we want to hear about IndieBio and what you're building up there.
I think I fixed my video, if that lag is slightly better. Okay, great. Awesome. My name is June Axup. I'm Chief Science Officer and Partner at IndieBio. And IndieBio is a startup accelerator. We've been around for over 5 years, based in San Francisco and now in New York. We help life science companies start from the very bare bones of once they put together a team and start working on their science, their business, and in our 4-month program, they go on and pitch at demo day and raise their seed round. We invest in across all areas of life sciences. So of course, we're interested in machine learning, computational, the merge of bio and tech, but also for applications of both human health and planetary health. So planetary health being food, agriculture, and now a lot of carbon sequestration plays as well. So yeah, really happy to be here. And then personally, I have not lived in LA, but I was in San Diego for 5 years. So so definitely saw the kind of the emergence of the tech entrepreneurship culture in San Diego as well. And I can see that there's a lot of ties with LA and Silicon Valley as well.
Great, thank you. I mean, we really want to hear more about that experience in our kickoff question, which is, for those of you who are in LA, what do you think LA's secret sauce is really for this digital AI transformation to happen? And for those of you who have that balanced perspective, like June and Dylan, with some other regions and areas, what do you think has to happen to have LA really boom? So what should we be focusing on to really build this ecosystem out? So Kevin, I'll let you kick it off for the LA love, and then we'll go to Llewellyn, Dylan, and then June.
Happy to. I mean, I think if I just look back when I first moved back here 8 years ago, this was still a time when a lot of Silicon Valley or New York venture firms, they didn't spend much time down in LA. They might have one person who said, hey, I want to add LA as a geo, and I'll go visit it a couple of times a year. And there was still that stereotype that LA is really, the real strength is in all of its Hollywood entertainment ties and anything related to digital media or consumer. But for us, even at that point, we had already had a pretty diverse portfolio in LA of various companies across consumer and enterprise. And then over the last 8 years, it's really ballooned into everything from software to machine learning to hardware and robotics to the life sciences. And I think that's a great reflection of just how much the ecosystem has grown here. And these companies also have now, instead of just the very sort of dense cluster down in Santa Monica, Venice, kind of that whole west side area. I mean, I'm sure Llewellyn will talk about this as well. And you now see companies everywhere in LA. And I think that's a good, again, a good symbol that people want to come down here and want to build up companies. And it's such a large city with such a diverse population that you end up seeing all these little clusters coming up and developing. Now, I'm sure we'll get into this. That is, I think, both a positive and a negative. I think you do have a lot of choice to start companies wherever you want in LA. And there's a lot of different, price points you can go at and places people can choose to live in. But also, we do tend to, always get the question around where is the center of the biotech industry in LA, and frankly, that's more just a reflection of where the universities are, where some of the larger biotechs are, and I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to try to connect all of these different places together. I would say sort of before COVID hit, we were just seeing a lot more communication around each of those areas. I remember there were tons of events that were finally happening in each of those areas, and people were coming in from the other regions. And hopefully actually with all the virtual stuff these days and this new pattern that actually only just speeds up and accelerates this trends towards kind of this whole region collaborating more together. So anyway, that's something I'd love to see more of.
No, absolutely. I think the explosion in virtual content and the ability to network with people and not have to drive 45 minutes to an hour and a half on a freeway, I agree. I think it's really connecting us in a way that we haven't had before. So Llewellyn, I'd love to hear your perspective on what you think makes LA great, and if you've got any insight as well into what maybe some of the challenges are. You got to unmute.
Sorry, I lost a few minutes. I had to reconnect. But yeah, kind of to riff off of what Kevin was saying, I think historically one of the things that people have knocked LA for is being more of a distributed space, and there's certain people have what has been proven this year to be a completely illogical idea that everything has to be clustered in one very little small space to be effective. And COVID has really shown us that this is what we do anyway. That we can collaborate across a larger geographic space, and it's not really that necessary to literally be living on top of each other, nice as it is to hang out in normal times. But I think that this has shown how really large our ecosystem is here. It might not have seemed so much from the outside because it's kind of dilute. It's spread over a very large area, but that said, there is this really vast community of biotech and entrepreneurship in LA. And big picture, I think the thing that stands out most for me, and really the core thesis of why we presented our vision for the Los Angeles Bioscience Fund to the county when we applied in the first place, is that Los Angeles has diversity. More than any other city in America, and that's not just ethnic and social diversity. It's diversity of industry, which is something that frankly is very, very rare in the US and holds a lot of cities back. But as we look at biology, moving beyond biomedical applications, of which we have actually created a few very big firms in LA, so it's not like we don't do anything there. But as it starts moving into areas as diverse as food and energy and materials, Los Angeles is the national capital for most of those industries. So once you kind of get past your biological proof of concept, this is the place to scale those most effectively, with the best industry connections, the best supplier connections, and frankly, the biggest port in the West Coast, all of the international connections that you could possibly ever want. So long term, we're very long LA. We see this as the true hub of future biotech, simply because of the unmatchable array of assets that we have here across industries.
I think that's really interesting. And we do see a lot of connections, at least from our startups at Caltech, to Asia as a result of the positioning on the West Coast. Not that San Diego and San Francisco don't have that too, with a quick flight over, but it really does make a difference in who you choose as your partners when you can be at least in a little bit better of a time zone, and also a quick plane ride over once we get back to traveling again internationally. So Dylan, I'd love to hear your perspective from San Francisco, Boston area. You've seen this happen multiple times. What do you think is great about LA, but also some challenges or some things we have to keep in mind as we start to grow this ecosystem?
Yeah, no, I think Llewellyn sort of hit on a key point around the diversity available, diversity of industry and talent in LA. I mean, I think a big challenge for startups is finding good management, executive talent early in the company's trajectory. And that's something that needs to come out of industry. So, the fact that Amgen's there, the fact that Kite had a great exit there, starting to create this generational turnover of folks who've succeeded and can give back to the startup ecosystem, either as angel investors or founders. I think, Boston obviously has a head start on biotech. You mentioned partnering and proximity being useful. There's nothing that can replicate stepping out of your office in Kendall Square and being able to hit all of the top pharma, biopharma within a few block radius. Even the Bay Area is pretty far behind there in the biotech world. But we do have that generational entrepreneurship. And I think when I was in LA, I did notice some burgeoning, enthusiasm around Silicon Beach and the sort of the tech and, other ecosystems. But for biotech, I think it's still very early. There hasn't been the same level of incubation, startup accelerators that we've seen in these other places. Even Boston now has a few of those. I think a big moment for bio in LA was when, Caltech had decided to have an EIR for the first time, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Helen, you're in that role now, but I remember when, they first set that up. Caltech went from having maybe 1 or 2 startups a year to like 15 in the first year after that. And so I think really diving in, and not just Caltech, but also the great hospital systems we have there. I know Cedars-Sinai runs a good program with Techstars to do, hospital related startups, but I think we could have a lot more of that in bio, SynBio, some of the new engineering oriented technologies. So I'll stop there.
And June, that's a perfect segue to IndieBio because you're running an accelerator. So I'd love to hear your perspective on what might need to happen in LA and what might be a path forward to really kind of boom and grow from what you've seen in San Francisco.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said on the panel already. We've just from our side, we've had 3 companies that came out directly out of UCLA. And using technology out of there, and then another 2 of our companies went on and relocated to LA after IndieBio because they actually saw that one of them was in food, one of them in agriculture. That between the lifestyle and the network that they had there, it was a much better place for them to grow their company. As was kind of mentioned, LA might be thought of as the Hollywood hub previously, but I think it's actually LA kind of leads in culture, and from the consumer biotech and food and goods, that kind of culture and bringing biology into the masses, I think is highly has a huge potential coming out of LA. So and then from the side of the ecosystem, being a little bit biased, I do think that having a accelerator incubator space is really important, and I have seen ones popping up in LA as well. The biggest thing for early entrepreneurship is 2 things: both the network and then also just lab space. Lab space is so expensive. If you can find shared lab spaces, and that way any angel money that you off with, it can be put into operational funds versus buying a centrifuge. So I think that's kind of the biggest hurdle for all of biotech companies is just the amount of capital needed. And if you can reduce that capital as much as possible, then the activation energy barrier gets lowered by a lot. So that was our model at IndieBio is, there are a lot of incubators in the Bay Area as well, but they're oftentimes still you have to have some money in order to pay a monthly fee to use the incubator and use the equipment. Our model was very different in that you can apply with just a idea almost and having nothing, but we will give you both funding and space for 4 months. So it is, capped at 4 months so that we can, that's a part of our business model. And of course we're VC ourselves, so we do take equity in the companies to help them start. But that was a huge leap for us. And, at the time, nobody was doing this because it is a lot of capital expenditure that we take. And then we're kind of investing that as a part into the companies too. So that has been working out pretty well for us. It is definitely very difficult to do from a VC level or somebody has to bankroll that, obviously. So we're really lucky that our firm saw the need for a lab space. But to as the panelists have mentioned, once you start that ball rolling and you have people with successes, they can put in more money and put more into the ecosystem to catalyze that. So really looking forward to seeing the LA ecosystem growing.
Really great point. I think it was a report actually out of ULP that just highlighted it's cost 10 times as much for a biotech space versus a tech space. And we've seen that as well for our startups. So you're absolutely right. Being able to leverage an accelerator incubator in the early days, make those dollars become the most efficient you possibly can, lets you hit those milestones, get to the next stage, and be prepared to fundraise. And we have a lot of great ones now in LA, I will say, for pretty much everybody's different scaled needs, which is great. They're distributed. They're not all together, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because pretty much you have one near every academic center in LA. So it's pretty cool. So as regards, where you see the really exciting gaps or opportunities. So we talked a little bit about culture, consumer, the ability to have access to partners in the LA space. What are some of the opportunities in LA that might make it a little bit unique? Which are gaps that you think could be filled by startups, new concepts that could really do well in LA versus some other place? And Dylan, we're going to kick it off with you because you happen to be up in the upper left.
Okay, so that's a tough one. I mean, I could talk about gaps in the markets that I focus on, in drug discovery and drug development in LA in particular. Thinking about, so I focus on drug discovery, drug development. So it's really gaps in like treatments available to patients. So rare diseases, places in oncology, gene and cell therapy. Those aren't gaps. I mean, everyone's working in them, but I think there's really an opportunity for, founder-led startups with a heavy engineering bent to really make a big difference there in terms of, providing better tools to collect, analyze, and understand the data that comes out of these biosystems. I probably should let Kevin or Llewellyn speak to the opportunities specific to LA. And, I don't know if you meant that more broadly than just in biotech, but again, that's where my focus is.
Yeah, I think really that combination for biotech, and how we can bring those things together. So, but I thought that was great. I mean, we do have specialists through our academic centers, right? And they do specialize in some of those gap areas for unmet needs. So that's definitely one of them. But Kevin, yeah, if you have a perspective or some insights based on what you're seeing that could be leveraged specifically in LA.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of go from the angle of, I think there's two components. One is, I think it was Dylan who brought up Kite and Amgen, and obviously there's been other important and big companies here that's been built on the life sciences side as well. And I think as an whether you're based here, you're an outsider, the obvious question is always like, why have there not been, 5 other cell therapy companies that have come up, since Kite exited and whatnot. And I think you look at it now, a few years later, there are a handful of them, right? It's not that there are none. And I think you just look at like early on, some of the folks actually decided to not sort of build their next company in LA. They actually moved elsewhere to do it. But then now you're seeing that more and more folks are doing that. And I think that's, again, a reflection of, people are starting to think about, okay, is there really, I don't know, such a lack of medicinal chemists in LA that I must, build my business elsewhere, or actually am I just not looking hard enough? I remember having a conversation actually with a UCLA professor who, ended up starting a company and then raised, the sort of typical Series A, kind of 30+ mil. And he really loved LA and wanted to build a company here, and ultimately kind of got convinced, partially by his co-founder, partially by his investors, to move up north. And one of the things he always said to me, that's why I bring up the medicinal chemistry thing, he's like, I think it's just really hard to find medicinal chemists down here. And then funnily enough, one of my portfolio companies, they ended up finding, a handful of really great people on the medicinal chemistry side, and it took them a little bit longer to identify them and build that relationship. But I do think those people are there. So I think that's sort of, if you want to call that sort of a gap or an opportunity, which is that the talent is here. I think there is a lot on perception. People just automatically think we should go to, sort of the most straightforward place, or like that's what everyone else does, and so that's what we do. But I really hope that not only I think it takes more than a single example, right? Like just because Kite happened doesn't necessarily mean like all Kite alums will then start companies in LA. I think it takes Kite, a couple alums to start companies here. They talk and find people, then the rest of the alums will be like, oh, maybe we could do it down here. And that's what I hope to see in terms of this, like, continued throughput of new companies. And I think actually SpaceX is a good example as well. Like, it took some time for SpaceX alums to then, really start to build their next set of companies. And in the early days, a handful of them built that up in SF. And then nowadays you see most of them staying here to build those next generation companies. And I think you're only going to see more happening, pulling from those, larger organizations that also are not just large, but had inherently pretty entrepreneurial, not just even the founders, but the people they hired, right? They were both rapidly scaling startups. And I hope to see more and more of that. And I think they're just lastly, I'd say there's little clusters that I hope talent from those areas start to come together. Like I remember talking to a postdoc or a PhD student who was at UCLA, and he's really a machine learning guy, and he really likes life sciences applications, but he ended up, and he wanted to be in LA, and didn't want to move up to SF. So he ended up going down to Orange County to find a job, right? Because there's a cluster of, most people don't notice, like security startups, including multiple like billion-dollar-plus companies that's happened over the last 10 years. And they have a huge need for machine learning talent. And so he sort of found his way down there. But, I connected with him because he's always curious, like, if you do run into sort of an interesting, machine learning centric kind of drug discovery company here in LA or Orange County, like, let me know, because I want to stay here. I want to join one of those companies, and I'm sure you're going to see more of them. So again, I think of those places also as great training grounds, and I think they'll continue to grow the talent. So hopefully that, they'll stick around for the next great LA biotech companies.
Yeah, I love that. And that gets to that theme we keep hearing about, that multi-generational talent. I mean, one of the things that made me so happy was a Dallas-based company, IndieBio, actually put their cell therapy manufacturing in Thousand Oaks. I'm like, yes. So it is getting a name to leverage all of that talent. Like Dylan was saying, people to stay in the area and continue, whether it's Kite or Atara or A2 Biotherapeutics or now Instill, that they can start to leverage that talent, keep it, grow it, develop it. And maybe they'll do something new. It doesn't have to be cell therapy, but it's, at least in that area, we're getting known as a cell therapy hub, especially for manufacturing. So it's pretty exciting. So June, I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah, I think the clustering idea is really interesting, because I think one thing I noticed when I moved to Silicon Valley is that people jump around a lot. And like, especially in startup world, people are at a startup for 2 years and then another one for another 2 years, and then they go start something themselves. So they're in a way have job security, because there are just so many companies always popping up, or companies that they can work at. And so I think having more, even big pharma attract more talent, and so that people feel like they can jump to different companies and if they need to, or if their interests changes. I think that also kind of, you start to hit that critical mass when you have a whole bunch of startups as well, because then you have people jumping between them. I found culturally, Silicon Valley has also this mentality of entrepreneurship. Like, if you talk to any PhD student, they're always like dreaming up ideas on the side, or thinking about how their research can be turned into a company. I don't think you find that in most other places. And just academia is academia. You do your research, you publish your paper, you go for your professorship, and I'm not sure how much of academia like stays in LA as well versus go elsewhere around the world. So trying to somehow shift the culture to get people to think, like, instead of just finishing with your academic project, can you actually leverage that and bring that out into the world and start your own company, and making ways to make that jump easier, I think would also increase the ecosystem.
I will say, I think there's too a generational change, because a lot of the engineering PhD students that we see coming into Caltech, they actually choose their advisors based on how entrepreneurial they are, because they're like, I want what I do with my science to mean something, and meaning something means translating it into the real world. So I love that energy and that focus now. And maybe it's because of where they've come from around the country, but I love hearing them say, I only want to go to a lab where what I do is going to matter. And I think that is a sea change from traditional academic mindset. It's really refreshing. So Llewellyn, we'd love to hear your perspective on what opportunities there are that for LA to fill some gaps, or to really leverage what they're.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, kind of riffing off what June was saying, there's kind of this critical mass issue. And in a way, I think the story of the last 5 or 6 years in Los Angeles has been the challenge of scaling an ecosystem, thinking of LA almost as a startup for startups. And how do we build out this infrastructure? Because, 6 years ago when I started Lab Launch, which is now the largest operator of lab space in the LA area, we started off originally as a bunch of entrepreneurs who were really tired of being told to go to San Diego or the Bay Area because there simply wasn't infrastructure here to support us. And from the very first, we've always thought about LA as a network rather than a hub and spoke model. So, we've opened spaces in the San Gabriel Valley, the San Fernando Valley, Orange County. We're looking to fill in those gaps, in the areas around UCLA, USC. And that's been a really interesting education for us. But I think kind of big picture, I think when we talk about like the opportunities in Los Angeles, I think it's uncontested. We have an amazing talent base. Just historically, we've had a brain drain. And kind of, I think our challenge so far has been starting to reverse that. And now I think, as a few people have said, it's about keeping those people and keeping them here for the long term. But I think, again, big picture, other than all the other stuff that happens in LA and all the other, opportunities, even though we're a big, expensive coastal city, we're still a lot more affordable than most. And especially when it comes to commercial and industrial space, which is what you need to build and scale labs. So I think that's something that's not talked about very often, but LA, for all its expensiveness, is just this, relatively affordable industrial space. And coupled with that, I think as we talk about, bringing in or attracting or keeping top management talent in the area, I think something that really is understated about Los Angeles is it's the world in a microcosm. And 30 minutes in any direction, you can have any kind of lifestyle your heart desires. You can have the big, dense city walkable lifestyle in downtown or maybe Santa Monica. You can have an acre with a picket fence. You can have a beachside house. You can live in the desert. All of these are, it's the old adage, you can surf and ski in a day, but you really can pick a space that's right for you. And as we think about how companies scale, I think one thing that's very often forgotten about biotech startups as opposed to tech startups is that even first-time entrepreneurs in our industry tend to be a little bit older. They're often PhDs or people with other advanced degrees. They're generally at least in their late 20s by the time they start a company. They're rarely the kind of 20-something go-getters, and so they're moving into an area of life where they're probably thinking, or many of them probably thinking about starting families, and where are their school districts and all of those kind of things. And so I think really the lifestyle diversity of Los Angeles is actually one of our greatest attractive factors, and that's something that we think is really important going forwards as we look to keep and bring more talent to the area.
Terrific. I will say one of the things we touched on, and Kevin brought it up, was pressure from investors to move to be a little closer. So I don't think we have a perfect solution for that unless all of them started to come and live and work in LA most of the time. But Dylan, you've seen this in a couple different places. How can we ensure that if LA is a good fit for all these other reasons, that there's a little more balance in that investor advice to just move up to the Bay Area? Or even, we've had a couple of our startups be pressured to move to Cambridge to take advantage of things. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
And I know investors in Boston, Cambridge, who will invest anywhere, but then they'll bring their companies to the East Coast because that's where the talent lives for the most part. And maybe they'd rather live in LA. I mean, to the last question, I think we have this great pool of graduating scientists and engineers who would love to stay in LA if there's opportunities for them to do so, but have traditionally left. That's, the brain drain Llewellyn was mentioning. But like, even personally, like I did a startup out of Caltech. We raised our angel investment in LA and we moved up to the Bay Area, and we didn't move because investors pressured us. We moved because that's where investors are. And we thought we'd have a better chance of finding a Series A, which we did by running around and taking advantage of the dense network of relationships with investors across, startups and academia that exists up here, unlike anywhere else in the world. And I think we need to make that happen in Boston. Like if you talk, I think June mentioned something about the entrepreneurial attitudes of folks in academia here, but go pick a random Stanford professor, and they almost certainly have had conversations with venture capitalists. That is not true about most universities around the world, and certainly not about those in LA. And I think we need more cross-pollination of ideas. It surprised me when you said you have grad students at Caltech trying to go into translational labs, because when I was there weren't translational labs. It's an engineering institute. And so I think, getting more people aware of what's possible and how quickly, they can see their work make a difference to patients is just a question of education and awareness. And it's not the kind of education you read in books. It's the kind of education you get by hanging out with people who've done it and cross-pollinating in ideas. So I think, how do we get people to stay? I think we need to bring investors there and show them what's available. Kevin and I recently invested in an LA company that moved up to the Bay Area, and let them speak to why their choice is there. But I would have been quite happy to keep them in LA if that's what was best for the company. So it's just a question of how and when we can make those transitions happen.
So June, you've had companies come in and then leave and maybe return to their hometown from whence they came, as well as stay in the Bay Area. So you probably see founders have to make these decisions over and over again. So if you could speak a little bit on the investment side, and then maybe on the founder side that you're seeing, to kind of riff off of Dylan's point of what's best for the company and what are some of the considerations for them to choose where they decide to build their company.
Yeah, I think Llewellyn made a great point that most of the founders we work with are not in their 20s, because they usually have a PhD, postdoc, maybe worked in industry for a while. So our average is about 35 years old. And so yeah, a lot of them are starting families. And so I think more often than not, maybe 2/3 of our companies go back to wherever they're from. We do take companies from all over the world, and especially during COVID, we've actually migrated into a virtual batch, of course, due to not being able to travel and all the restrictions. So people are kind of staying put where they are. There are, a lot of companies do end up choosing San Francisco as well. And it usually comes down to kind of what was mentioned before, the investor network. If they've already got a ton of investment, oftentimes they feel like this is the place to build the talent network. And then in some cases, it's just kind of like the hub of what they're doing and how that fits with kind of the area. So for example, I say the most like kind of prominent kind of growth in the last couple of years is kind of the alternative meat, future food kind of space. And that kind of started up in Oakland. And so now a lot of people are moving from around the world to be in Oakland. So they're here to interact with the investors, to interact with the network. They're going to, a lot of talent who are interested in alternative meat space are going to gather here. So I feel like that is something to think about in like developing LAs. Like, is there a strength in a certain sector that is really interesting? And I mentioned that a few of our companies did choose to move to LA afterwards. So there's a company called Perennial that makes a plant-based drink, mostly for the elderly. So that was one where they actually saw that the food industry and senior care might be more prominent in LA, that they chose to move down to LA. So I think it really depends on like the company of like what they need, where they think their networks are. But then on the founder level, I think starting a company, like you need to have a lot of emotional support. And so finding the people who like can help you through that via your family, via your friends, is going to be almost the most important thing to make sure you are grounded through your journey. So it's not so easy just to pick up and leave and start a company somewhere else.
So I'm going to go to Llewellyn and then to Kevin, because Llewellyn, you've seen a lot of people come through lab launch and make the decisions to stay or to go as they start to build. And so I'd love to hear, what might have been some key factors that we've heard about, family support, also of course space, but are there some other things that you've seen come into play? And then from the investor side, have you perhaps ever encouraged one of your investments to move somewhere else because it was a better choice for them?
Yeah, a few good questions there. So, yeah, I think, you know, uh, historically, and I think this is getting a little easier now, it has been that kind of trade-off. People don't really want to move, as a rule, and there's an exception to everything. But when I imagine, a scientist startup founder who's come and been educated in Los Angeles, maybe they did an undergrad here or they did their PhD at Caltech, and now they're thinking of starting a company. They're here for a reason. Either they're from here or they wanted to move here, and so it never made sense to me to be like, oh, you've got to move somewhere else. And I think, frankly, the last 6 months of COVID have really kind of taught us, as the VC point of view, that maybe we can be a little more flexible about where our companies live, and I think that's increasingly true, in globally. Frankly, there's a market and a place for every company where they can be optimal. And obviously, I believe Los Angeles is great for a lot of things, right? But for sure, we haven't exported any companies from MarsBio, but we have invested in companies that are in Texas, for instance, where there's a really good opportunity for the particular work they're doing. Actually, one of our companies who is based in Los Angeles has Amber Cycle, who has actually created a way to recycle polyester threads and make unrecyclable clothes recyclable. They're actually raising a Series A now to build a second plant in the Houston area, where there's obviously a lot of the chemical gas infrastructure, and so that can feed directly into the same supply chains. So I think that certain companies, there's always a geographic advantage, especially if you're dealing with kind of large quantities, bulk products. You need to plug into an existing supply chain. And to June's point about cultured meat, that's a huge area that's blowing up, and a lot of it is happening in Oakland right now. But 90% of America's food comes through Los Angeles at some point. So this is where the market is. So I want those guys to come here. We're all good friends. But yeah, it's an interesting kind of dynamic. And, I think one of the things that really, makes Los Angeles very, very special is the opportunity to cross-pollinate industries. There's just so many verticals here that are very, very strong. My wife is a fashion designer, so if I come across a company that's thinking of making a thread or a material out of biological material, that's an industry that there's a lot of subtlety and nuance to how the supply chains work, and you need to be able to plug into that. So that's one area we think is very, very strong in Los Angeles. Another one that's not often talked about is Los Angeles County has one of the biggest public health systems in America. And certainly, as we're talking about digital and artificial intelligence and big data kind of startups that can help improve the efficiency and the quality of healthcare delivery. This is a wonderful testing ground for that, because we have such a huge and diverse population. So whether you need to study an ethnic group, an economic strata, or geographic differences, those are all possible here in one place. And I think that's a very, very important aspect for companies looking to get into that space.
You mentioned the fashion industry, because we had a startup recently that was basically functionalized clothing, right? So they make the weave and the clothing do a lot more than just be attractive clothing. And one of their reasons to stay was, fashion. It's either LA or New York. And they're like, we're already in LA, Pasadena, we're staying here. So you're absolutely right. I think sometimes you really see these nice connections come together in ways that you don't always expect. So Kevin, you've been in LA, you left, you came back. So how do you think we can kind of get investors to be a little bit more excited, or even if not excited, open to companies staying in LA, or maybe even relocating here?
I might be overly optimistic, but I do think, and some people have already mentioned this, like COVID is actually, I think we'll really see, a ton of the long-term repercussions from all this remote virtual stuff, maybe starting to really happen next year. But you can even read in the press, let alone if you are an investor and just happen to have a lot of investor friends. we talked about the brain drain out of LA. I mean, there's an actual brain drain out of San Francisco now, right? And frankly, as a VC, unlike most companies, especially heavy infrastructure companies, you can live anywhere. A bunch of the VCs I already know have a vacation home in LA. And now a bunch of them are choosing to move to LA or move to Austin or move up to the Pacific Northwest or move to Utah or whatever, right? Like, I think that is actually happening. Like, it's been happening for the last few years, but the clip just dramatically increased. And so I think that'll definitely help quite a bit. Once you're not, as an investor, once you're now in a different place and not like, once you go from a single office firm to a distributed firm, then I think your thinking actually shifts pretty dramatically. Like, we've been a single office firm pretty much for the whole history of the firm. And then last year we added a partner in SF, and then we also added a manager out in Paris. It was kind of, I guess, lucky that we had a little bit of practice for COVID, but that's actually made a pretty big shift in our own mentality, how we think about where to back companies and things like that. And we're just even more open to companies being wherever they want to be. And if you want to be in a place that people think is suboptimal or less optimal for whatever it is you're going to do, like, we just want to see entrepreneurs who are willing to invest in that ecosystem, right? Like, look at what Recursion did in Utah and sort of the entire cluster that they built out there. And like, that is all possible. And I think it's more work up front, but then once you do it, like, you become known, right? For that cluster, you're the leader of that cluster, and you'll have a pretty amazing advantage to try to bring talent there. And so I think that's a big part that I think is just getting very accelerated. And then the other thing is really just, I think it comes down to some of these, hopefully more collaboration between the various industries and the various VCs and the labs and the universities as well. Like, I think June and Llewellyn both talked about food and alternative ingredients and Symbio there. I mean, like, Beyond Meat has been down here the whole time. They're down in El Segundo, right below Venice, and I'm actually seeing now a new generation of alternative ingredients companies come out of here. And you look at, like, some of the latest ones, right? It's like, well, how did that happen? Like, okay, so they can get talent from Beyond Meat. The CEO, used to work at, I think it was like Beachbody, which is, I'm sure many of you have seen their fitness videos and whatnot. That's like a giant company in the consumer space. And then they look at literally the entire kind of food industry in LA and a lot of the, push for vegetarian, vegan, alternative food. Like, a lot of the chefs are down here. And then it was actually kind of a no-brainer for them to say, we would build a company here. And that was actually by an SF investor who was like, yes, you should do it down there. Like, that's where we know a bunch of people too. And it makes sense. So I think, I think more people will see and tie those connections together. And then I think, again, it just starts with one, and then they'll start to, it takes a few years, but then they'll start to grow exponentially after that. So I'm pretty optimistic that we're now really hitting into that, the inflection on the exponential curve, and that, like, if we have this conversation again in 2 years, I think the tone of it will be very different.
I love that vision. I hope we get to come back 2 years from now and look backwards and say, wow, how much has changed, because that would be an amazing success. So I think it's wrap up time. So just final thoughts from you guys. One of the questions that I get a lot for people who are not associated with an academic center. So if somebody's at Caltech, they get our office, right? They get all of our connections. They get a lot of help and support to make it happen, to find space, to find investors, to find talent. But for those who are, not associated with one of those institutions that have a great idea, I'm sure you get asked all the time too, how do they build that support network around them and get connected? So Dylan, I'd love to hear from you, and any final thoughts as we wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to have the resources of an institution available. And if you're doing something in hard tech or biotech, you probably have someone on your team who has an association with some institute, whether it's Caltech or somewhere else. And, leaning on the alumni networks is really helpful. But, I know COVID makes the sort of serendipitous networking really challenging. And, hopefully we'll go back to a world where, you can should have hit the pavement and take the initiative to like pick up the phone or send a note. It's surprising, people will respond, especially if you have a good story to tell. And, for us, it's less about the idea, or certainly not about the credentials. It's really about what you've done, what you can do, helping me believe that you can do what you say and that the opportunity is there. So, I don't think it's limiting to not have that institutional support, but certainly it helps. I would say, hard to think about, thinking about how, if we stay in a virtual world forever, you do that element of networking. Hopefully we'll get better tools like the one we're using to help conference participants, actually talk to. I don't know. I remember when I was a founder, I literally would just go to all of these events and go up to the panel afterwards and harass whoever would talk to me until they gave me their card. And, it was that element of just talking to people. It took us 100 VCs before we found one that wanted to do the Series A. So I think tenacity, persistence, those are the qualities that will help you succeed in startup world. So.
And you build a network around them. So if you can talk a little bit about how they get access to a high-profile incubator, accelerator, or just riffing off some of the other things you've seen be successful for getting connected to a support system.
Yeah, definitely. I think getting into various organized networks, such as various other incubators and stuff, is already a help. But at the end of the day, nobody's going to have all the answers for you. Like, you have to hustle. So like Dylan was saying, going out and talking to people, I hate the word hustle, but the main thing as an entrepreneur, I'd say, is to really shift into this like open curiosity mindset. And where I see entrepreneurs fail is if they like have like their baby that they want to sell and they need to perfect that baby before like sending it off into the world. That will get you nowhere, because you're just going to have a lot of fear and anxiety around this. But it's the iteration of going out, reaching out, trying something, failing, but learning from that and continuing is ultimately going to launch a company. And I think every company is all about a series of failures that then eventually leads to a success. So yeah, I think like just saying that, oh, I've got into an accelerator or something is only the beginning. It is the first step of the hustle. Now hustle your next customer, hustle your advisors and whatnot.
I love that. Llewellyn, how about you? Final thoughts and, anything about getting connected into this support network?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like Dylan said, I think about 5 or 6 years ago, I spent every other night driving halfway across town to go to some meetup or something just to kind of do this stuff and, stay until you talk to 3 people and then you can run away and cry. Because, I hate having to do this social stuff, but it's part of the learning experience. But I think this is actually a really important development that really has started to take root over the last few years here in Los Angeles. And it's really easy to reduce LA to the 10 corridor from Santa Monica through UCLA to USC in downtown and then Caltech. And that's, sure, in and of itself a major city. But this is the largest county in America. This is a G20 country by itself. And we have over 100 colleges of higher education that are all producing all kinds of talent. And so, that's something that actually, if you look at how we've started developing, in LA, we do have this kind of decentralized model. I have my labs all over the place. We have Lundquist Institute now down in the South Bay. There's the LA Biospace Incubator now opening at Cal State LA in East Los Angeles. So there's these regional opportunities. And I think what's been really great to see is the community that's driven a lot of this is really key to things. And you've got a lot of organizations from Biotech Connection LA, who are a student and young professional led group, to Bioscience LA is a nonprofit, set up by the county, and some major partners like Amgen to really promote and connect the region. And also, Biocom, CLSA, all of these trade organizations have all been taking this very seriously. So, whether you're in Long Beach or Sylmar or, there's some stuff going to be happening near you geographically when life eventually gets back to normal. But there are these networks that are really focused on making sure that we reach as many parts of the geographic area as possible, and interacting with them. And obviously MarsBio, we have a very similar outlook. We have companies in East LA, in Long Beach, in Monrovia. They're spread around the city for wherever makes sense for their particular business. And I think that speaks to a theme we were all talking about. So I think the take home is just these people are out there. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of meetups and networking opportunities. And long before you even start thinking about starting your company, AILA is another great one. Sorry, interact with these folks. Go to the webinars. Pick up the learnings and make friends. And there's the world is your oyster here. It really is.
I love that, because I also love the piece that Dylan and June were saying. It is up to you. Like, you have to go out there. As uncomfortable as it is, there is already a lot here. It's up to you to go find it and really develop it. And I like your piece about do it early, so that maybe it's not so daunting, so that you already have this group maybe of 20 around you when you start to be serious about getting your startup off the ground. So Kevin, any final thoughts to wrap up the session?
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with what everyone else said. And I'll just home in on one particular aspect with, as an investor, people want to get to investors, they want to talk to them. And I think you see a lot of conventional knowledge around like, oh, VCs don't respond to like cold emails and LinkedIn messages and whatnot. But I think you'd be surprised, right? Like, first of all, a VC firm is more than just that one partner who might have stated, let's say, an interest in biotech. So you're like, oh, that's the only person I can ever get to at that VC firm who care about what I do. Like, that's just not true, right? Like, you need to think about all the networks and the affiliations that you can try to tap into to get sort of to a common ground. And then you might be surprised. Like, a lot of times I do respond to those messages when I see that people actually put effort into writing them, right? Whether it's because we had a connection from an alma mater or, and even like the random, like, I might just at this moment be really interested in looking at companies who are working on, RNA technologies, let's say, right? And that's what you study, and you write in your message a bit about that and why you're sort of really interested in doing more. And like, you send that out not to one, but multiple VCs, and yeah, pretty likely at least one of them will be like, oh, like, actually, I want to learn more about that. And you were proactive enough to send me a thoughtful message, so I would respond. And again, there's the partner, there's the principal, there's the associate. Like, I mean, just look at our own associate, right? Like, she was an SF at BCG. She wanted to get into venture and just went to all the events, talked to a bunch of people, she tapped her like church network, right? Like, and like got to some VCs through that, et cetera. Like, you just have to be creative, and it's not like a one shot and you're in. You just got to keep at it. And frankly, that is a huge signal for sort of whether you really do want to sort of be an entrepreneur long term and you're willing to go through all that versus not. And that's a quality that I think all investors, whether they're angels to early stage to late stage, that they'll appreciate. So I encourage people to not give up and keep trying. And there's, as you can see in the public markets and the private markets, there's a lot of money out there. There's a lot of investors. One might get you to the next one. So make sure to keep hustling on that front.
You guys are fantastic and so positive. So I love this. This has been a great session. Thank you so much for your time. I know folks are going to be going to a networking session after this. So thank you. And it was great to hear your thoughts about what makes LA special and the future of biotech here. So bye-bye until we meet again virtually.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Good to see you.